The cold from the grave still clung to my skin when I stepped back into my house, carrying the weight of a world that no longer had my husband in it. The air outside had smelled of wet soil and something final, something that whispered an ending I wasn't ready to hear. Even now, as I shut the door behind me, I could feel the scent of lilies woven into my coat, like a stubborn memory refusing to loosen its grip. My Henry had been laid into the ground barely an hour ago, and the silence of our living room rose up around me like a tidal wave. I don't think I'd ever feared quiet before, but that day, it felt like the quiet intended to swallow me whole. People had followed me to the house after the service, their voices soft and respectful, but all of them were too gentle, too careful, as if my grief might shatter into pieces if they breathed too loudly. I felt like a porcelain teacup someone had accidentally dropped and then taped back together, still shaped like what I once was, but crackling, fragile, one wrong touch away from collapsing entirely. My friends gathered plates of food no one wanted. They straightened cushions that didn't need straightening. They wiped counters already clean. I understood what they were doing. They were trying to fill the space Henry used to fill so effortlessly with presence. But presence born from pity feels like an echo, familiar, but empty. I stood near the window and watched my son arrive, his car gliding into the driveway as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Marcus stepped out, adjusting his coat, brushing imaginary dust from the sleeves like he was preparing for a business meeting rather than coming back from burying the man who raised him. His girlfriend, Belle, followed closely, her heels clicking too loudly on the pavement. I watched her flip her hair as she spoke into her phone, as if today were simply an inconvenience she had to endure before something more exciting. When they entered, Marcus kissed my cheek barely and Belle gave me a hug that felt like someone pressing a cold envelope to my shoulder. Stiff, quick, and transactional. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Albright," she said. The way one might read a line from a script they'd never rehearsed. I didn't feel anger at first, just a hollow disappointment that slid down my spine. But disappointment is a seed, and grief is fertile soil. It wasn't long before the seeds started to sprout. People wandered through the house, picking at food, exchanging soft stories about Henry's garden or his old fishing jokes. His chair sat in the far corner of the living room, the same old brown recliner he used to pretend was perfectly fine. Even after the Springs started protesting, it sat there now like a monument to everything he'd been. Steady, comfortable, warm. I kept looking at it, half expecting him to call out from it, teasing me for fussing or reminding me we were out of sugar again. But the chair was still, and I had never felt its emptiness so sharply. At some point, voices drifted from the dining room. Marcus and Belle, speaking in hushed tones, but not hushed enough. Normally, I would have busied myself with guests or slipped away quietly. But grief does strange things. It sharpens the ear, the mind, the instincts. I moved closer without meaning to, as if pulled by a thread. "Should get the place appraised quickly," Belle murmured. My breath hitched. Marcus sighed, impatient. "I know. It's worth a fortune now, especially with the renovations she never made. Older houses like this, people love them for the character. We could flip it for double. Flip my house. The home Henry built memories into with his own hands." Belle's voice was light, careless. "Just explain to her that it's too much for her to manage alone. You'll be helping her. It's the perfect time while everything is delicate. My grief had been called many names over the years because Henry had been sick before he passed. People had used words like hard, painful, heavy, but never delicate. Delicacy was what you used to describe petals, or lace, or desserts. Not a woman standing at the edge of a world without her husband. I leaned against the wall for support. My fingers were trembling. Marcus had lowered his voice, but I heard him clearly. "If we move fast, she won't question it. She trusts me. Always has." Something flickered inside me, not quite anger yet, but the spark of something sharper. I stepped back into the living room, letting guests fill my senses again. Their kindness soothed the sting Marcus's words had left. But the spark continued to glow under my ribs. Belle approached me after a while, her smile polished but hollow. "Mrs. Albright, you must be exhausted. Marcus and I were thinking maybe you shouldn't be alone tonight. We could stay, or you could come home with us." "Home." She said the word like she owned its meaning. "No," I said simply. "This is my home." Belle blinked, her smile wavering, then nodded as if she understood. But she didn't understand at all. Hours later, when the last guest had hugged me goodbye and the house had finally emptied, the quiet pressed against me once more. I sank into Henry's chair not because I wanted to, but because it was the only place that still felt like it knew what to do with me. The imprint his body had left was still faintly there. My fingers brushed the armrest, and a sob rose and fell in my chest like a tide trying to decide whether to drown me or let me breathe. The front door opened again. Marcus, and Belle, trailing behind him. "I thought everyone left," I murmured. "We stayed to help," Marcus said, but he wasn't looking at the dishes or the cups or the clutter. His eyes were scanning the room, assessing the house the way a buyer not a son would. "We were also thinking," he continued carefully, "that maybe we should start sorting through Dad's paperwork. Things need to be handled fast." I stared at him, feeling the world tilt again. "Handled," I repeated. He nodded, stepping closer. "It's responsibility, Mom. And we should be practical about what's coming next, especially with the house." My grief cracked open then. Not enough to spill rage yet, but enough to let clarity through. I watched Marcus's face, my son's face, and I realized something devastating. He wasn't mourning his father. He was planning his future. Belle chimed in. "We already spoke to someone who said selling right now would be smart. Before you get overwhelmed by upkeep or expenses." Expenses, upkeep, practicality, words that pretended to care, but carried the scent of opportunism. I looked down at Henry's wedding band still warm on my finger, and felt a cold resolve begin to settle in my bones. I didn't argue. Not that night. I didn't accuse. I didn't confront. Because something told me the storm that was coming required more than emotion. It required strategy. Marcus and Belle eventually left, frustration simmering in the air because I had not agreed to anything. The moment their car disappeared down the street, I locked the door and breathed for the first time in hours. Henry's voice rose in my memory, not a real whisper, but the kind grief creates when it needs comfort. "You're stronger than you think, Nora." I nodded into the quiet. "I'll need to be." I didn't sleep that night, not even for a minute. The house creaked inside around me, settling into the cold after a long day of footsteps and condolences. I sat at the dining table with a cup of tea that never cooled because I never drank it. Papers were spread before me, insurance documents, account statements, Henry's old notes scribbled in margins he never let anyone read. By dawn, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I called Henry's lawyer at 8 sharp. When I told him Marcus had plans for the house, he exhaled slowly, like someone listening to a storm gathering in the distance. "Come in today," he said. "Bring everything." I hadn't expected my hands to shake as I hung up the phone, but they did, because betrayal by a stranger is an injury. Betrayal by your child is amputation. I dressed slowly, pulled my hair back, and slipped on Henry's old cardigan, the one that still carried his scent of cedar and warmth. I stepped outside into the cold morning, the air biting at my cheeks, and walked to my car with a steadiness I hadn't felt in weeks. Today was the beginning. Not of healing, not of vengeance, not even of justice. It was the beginning of truth, and I suspected truth would not be kind. I drove to the lawyer's office with my hands clenched too tightly around the steering wheel, the morning sun slicing across the windshield like thin blades of gold. The world outside looked painfully normal, people carrying coffee cups, buses sighing at stoplights, dogs tugging impatiently on their leashes, while inside me, something vast and dark churned like a storm swelling under my ribs. Grief had hollowed me, yes, but betrayal had sharpened me. It was a strange combination, like being both ghost and blade. Henry's lawyer, Mr. Lawson, met me at the door himself. He was older now, with hair the color of ash, and a gait that had softened with time, but his eyes were still sharp, still warm, still capable of cutting straight to the truth. "Nora," he said gently, "I'm so sorry about Henry." Hearing his name from someone who truly meant it almost crumpled me. I swallowed hard. "Thank you," I managed. "I need your help." And help he did. He sat me down in his office room, lined with books and memories and a faint scent of old paper, and let me unravel the story, all of it. The party Marcus wanted to host the night Henry was lowered into the ground. The whispered conversation about appraising my home. The pressure to make quick decisions. The way Belle had watched the house like a wolf circling a wounded deer. Mr. Lawson listened without interrupting, but his jaw tightened the longer I spoke. When I finished, he leaned back slowly, exhaling a long, steady breath. "Nora," he said, voice level but brimming with restrained anger. "What your son is attempting is not only morally reprehensible, it borders on coercion and financial exploitation." There. Someone finally said the words out loud, exploitation. The syllables fell into the air with the weight of stone, and something inside me solidified around them, because deep down, I had known. I had known Marcus wasn't just misguided or overwhelmed. I had known he had looked at my grief the way some people look at unlocked doors, Mr. Lawson continued. Before we proceed, I need to know something. Do you want to preserve your relationship with your son at all costs? Or do you want me to protect your interests, even if the truth creates permanent distance? I stared at him, my breath caught halfway up my throat, because he was asking the question I had been avoiding all night. Was I prepared to lose my son to save myself? The answer rose not from logic or fear, but from a quiet place of instinct, the same place that had steadied me through Henry's illness, through loneliness, through years of giving more than I received. I want the truth protected, I said, even if it means losing him. Mr. Lawson nodded once, a solemn acknowledgement of a decision that felt like slicing my heart open and stitching it closed in the same breath. Then we begin, he said, right now. For the next 2 hours, he walked me through steps I never imagined I'd need to take, freezing certain accounts temporarily, flagging unusual activity, updating documents Henry and I had prepared years ago, back when we assumed love would be shield enough for the people we trusted most. He drafted letters, placed calls, took notes with a swift, practiced hand. When he asked if I wanted to review the house deed, my stomach twisted. Yes, I said. He retrieved a file, opened it carefully, and slid it across the desk. My house, the home Henry and I had scraped and saved for, repainted 3 times, repaired every spring, filled with decades of warmth and holidays and little moments that had blended into a life. This stays with you, he said, unless you choose otherwise. Not Marcus, not anyone else. A tremor passed through me, not of fear but of clarity, because for the first time since Henry died, something felt steady, the ground beneath me, my spine, the shape of my future. When we finished, Mr. Lawson placed his pen down and folded his hands. Nora, he said softly, I need to tell you something, woman to woman, not lawyer to client. I met his gaze, bracing myself. You are not weak, he said, you are devastated, and people often mistake devastation for weakness, but grief sharpens the eyes. You saw what was happening in your home, even when your heart was breaking. That is strength. Something hot and surprising stung behind my eyes, but I didn't let the tears fall. Not here, not now. I drove home slowly, the sun beginning its descent behind the rooftops. The sky tinting itself in bruised colors: lavender, charcoal, pale gold. Dusk always made me think of Henry. He loved that time of day, when the world softened and the edges blurred, when everything looked like it had been dipped in warm honey. Walking into the house felt different this time, less like entering a tomb and more like entering a battlefield I was finally prepared to defend. I set my purse down, hung Henry's cardigan over the back of the chair, and stood in the middle of the living room with a stillness I hadn't felt since before the funeral. That was when the door opened again. Marcus didn't knock, didn't call first. He walked in like he owned the place, bell trailing behind him with a slightly smug expression that made my teeth clench. There you are, Marcus said, dropping his keys on the table. We've been trying to reach you. I was out, I said simply. Out. Belle echoed, her tone too sweet. On a day like this, her voice curled around the room like perfume that didn't belong. Marcus cleared his throat. We need to talk, Mom. I braced myself. The storm had arrived. We were thinking we could start sorting Dad's finances tonight, he said. We don't want things to get complicated. I watched him, really watched him. The tight jaw, the eyes scanning the walls as if picturing what the house might look like under a new coat of paint, the impatience simmering beneath his attempt at concern. Marcus, I said quietly, why the rush? He blinked, caught off guard. Because these things take time. And you're overwhelmed. Belle stepped closer, her voice dripping with practiced empathy. It's too much house for you now. You shouldn't have to deal with all this alone. There it was, wrapped in silk, dipped in sugar, handed to me as if it were love. Control disguised as care. I stepped toward the window, letting the fading light cast a long shadow across the room. This home isn't a burden, I said. It's mine. Marcus exhaled in frustration. We're trying to help you. No, I said. You're trying to help yourselves. The silence that followed was sharp, jagged. Belle's smile slipped first. That's unfair. Is it? I asked, turning to face them. Marcus's mask cracked then. For the first time since Henry's death, he dropped the veneer. This house is valuable, he snapped. You can't maintain it forever, and you don't need all this space. We could get a good price. I'm not selling, I said. He stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. You don't get it, he said. You're making this harder than it needs to be. His voice rose in patience, sharpening each syllable. I felt something shift inside me then, a deep, ancient strength. The kind that comes from surviving heartbreak and raising children and burying the love of your life. I met with Mr. Lawson today, I said. Marcus froze. What? Belle whispered, color draining from her face. He advised me to secure everything Henry and I built. So I did. Marcus swallowed hard. What does that mean? It means, I said calmly, that nothing happens without my consent. Not the finances, not the accounts, not the house. The room went still. No, Marcus said, shaking his head. No, this isn't fair. You can't. I can, I said. And I did. I watched the realization wash over him, the realization that the window he thought he could climb through had slammed shut. Belle was the first to speak. We were just trying to help. No, you weren't, I said softly. And the worst part is, you thought I wouldn't notice. Marcus's face twisted with a mixture of anger and something that looked almost like fear. He took one step toward me, then stopped himself. Is this what you want? To push us away? I looked at him, my son, my child, my heartbreak, and answered honestly, double quotes, no. This isn't what I wanted, but it's what you chose. He stood there for a long moment, chest rising and falling, eyes darting between me and Belle and the home he'd already imagined as his dot. Then he grabbed his keys, muttered something under his breath, and stormed out. The slam of the front door rattling the picture frames. Belle hesitated, forcing a tight smile. He's upset. He didn't mean, but I had already turned away. She left quietly, like a shadow slipping down the front steps. The house settled into silence again, but this time, the silence did not swallow me. It held me, it wrapped around me like a shawl. For the first time since the funeral, I felt the faintest tremor of power returning to my bones, not the power to hurt, but the power to choose, to defend, to remain standing in a world that had tried to knock me flat. I walked to Henry's chair and sat down, letting my fingers rest along the worn fabric. Did I do the right thing? I whispered into the dim light. In the stillness, I felt it again, that phantom warmth of him, the echo of his voice, the steady certainty he carried even in silence. You did what you had to do, Nora. And for the first time in days, I closed my eyes and breathed, without breaking. The next morning, the sun crept through the curtains like a hesitant visitor, touching the edges of the room with a pale golden hand. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of tea that had long since gone cold, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, one of those small domestic sounds you never notice until life becomes painfully still. I kept thinking Marcus would call, that he'd send some clumsy message, half apology, half justification. He always tried to rewrite his cruelty into concern after the storm passed. But the minutes slid into hours, and the phone stayed silent. It shouldn't have surprised me. People who want to control you rarely check whether you're breathing as long as they still believe they can reach your pockets. By noon, I'd opened the windows to let in the soft spring air. The house breathed with me, its walls exhaling a long, weary sigh, as if it too had been bracing for something that never arrived. I walked slowly from room to room, touching frames, rearranging flowers, straightening cushions, all the small rituals of reclaiming a space someone else tried to invade. I found myself in Henry's study. Dust motes floated in the beam of light like tiny wandering souls, drifting with no urgency, no demands. I lowered myself into his old leather chair, the one with the creak that always announced him before he spoke, and felt an unexpected calm wash over me. Look what your boy tried to do, I whispered into the empty room. But the room didn't feel empty. It felt like a pause in a long conversation, as if Henry were leaning in to let me finish. I thought about Marcus, not as the man who had stood in my living room, dripping entitlement, but as the child who used to run up the driveway with scraped knees and a breathless grin, shouting, "Mama, look what I made." Somewhere between that boy and this man, something had splintered, not suddenly, not overnight, but through slow cracks that widened while I wasn't looking. Somewhere between that boy and this man, something had splintered, not suddenly, not overnight, but through slow cracks that widened while I wasn't looking. That realization sat heavy on my chest, not guilt, not blame, just the sorrow of understanding that love does not always raise character. A soft knock startled me. When I opened the door, it was my neighbor's daughter, Lacey's sweet girl, barely with nervous hands and kind eyes. "Miss Nora," she said, "I just wanted to bring these over." She held a plate of warm cinnamon rolls. The smell alone nearly undid me. "You've been on my mind," she added, "ever since the funeral." Her gentleness, so effortless and uncalculated, landed like a warm hand on a bruised shoulder. I invited her in, and she stepped carefully, as though afraid to disturb the quiet. We sat at the table, steam rising between us. "People talk," she said softly. "I heard your son was here the other day. He didn't sound very kind." I laughed, a small brittle sound. "Kindness isn't something he carries in large supply anymore." She hesitated. "My mom says grief cleans the lens, shows people who they really are." I nodded, staring down at the soft golden swirl of the pastry. "Then I suppose I've seen more clearly than I wanted to." After she left, a breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the distant sound of children playing down the street. Their laughter rose and fell, like bright little waves, a reminder that the world moves forward whether we cling to it or not. It was then, standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the hallway, that I understood something simple and terrible and freeing. I could love my son without trusting him. I could mourn who he once was without surrendering to who he had become. And I could protect myself without becoming cold or cruel. Strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered. That evening, when the sky dimmed to a soft charcoal and the lights in the neighborhood blinked on one by one, I brewed myself a fresh cup of tea. I stepped onto the porch, wrapped Henry's cardigan around my shoulders, and let the quiet settle around me like an old friend. I didn't know if Marcus would ever come back, not truly. Not as the boy I raised, and I didn't know if I even wanted him to. But I did know this. I had survived my husband's death. I had survived my son's betrayal, and I would survive whatever came next. Because the world had tilted beneath my feet, but it had not knocked me down. A late spring wind brushed past, soft and cool, almost like a breath, almost like Henry telling me, "You're doing just fine, Nora." And for the first time since I laid him to rest, I believed it. In the days that followed, the world settled into a quieter rhythm, the kind that doesn't hurry you or demand explanations. I moved through the house with a gentleness I hadn't felt in months. Touching the edges of picture frames, watering plants, humming to myself without realizing it. Grief didn't disappear. It simply softened, like a bruise turning from dark violet to a pale yellow you can finally press without flinching. Every now and then my phone would vibrate with an unfamiliar number. Always Marcus. I could feel it, but I let the calls dissolve into silence. Sometimes love means opening your arms. Sometimes it means keeping a door closed long enough to let a person face their own reflection. One evening, near dusk, I stepped onto the porch with a wool blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The sky was painted in fading gold, the kind of light Henry used to call God's last good brushstroke of the day. I lowered myself onto the old rocking chair, the wood groaning softly beneath me. Familiar and forgiving. A single firefly hovered near the railing, blinking its tiny lantern in the dimming air. Funny how small lights become easier to see when the world grows dark. I closed my eyes and breathed in the cool scent of earth and lilac from the garden. It felt like breathing in my own childhood, my own mother, my own past lives, all stitched into one long exhale. And for the first time, I didn't feel like the widow left behind or the mother betrayed. I felt like a woman standing on her own 2 feet. Steady in the quiet. Maybe Marcus would return someday, not with excuses, but with humility. Maybe he wouldn't. Either way, I had finally remembered something I forgot while trying to hold everyone else together. My heart is mine. My home is mine. My peace is mine. And as the rocking chair creaked beneath me and the last light slipped behind the trees, I realized that endings aren't always loud. Sometimes they come like this, soft, tired, and strangely hopeful. I whispered into the twilight, not to anyone living, but to the man who'd walked beside me for nearly half a century. "I'm still here, Henry. And I'm learning how to live again." The night answered with a warm, quiet hush, and I let it hold me.